Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this public segment of the Hague Institute's Conference on the Future of Cyber Governance. This conference comes at a crucial time in both the development of internet governance and global governance arrangements more broadly. The governance of cyberspace is a key priority in our global governance program, alongside conflict prevention and the rule of law, one of the three research programs at the Institute. A young and vibrant think and do tank, the Institute conducts policy-relevant research, convenes expertise, and conducts trainings at issues at the intersection of peace, security, and justice. How cyberspace is governed has significant implications for a range of critical issues, from national security to the protection of individuals' rights and freedoms. Yet the governance of cyberspace is highly contested. Tensions exist between those who favor private sector-led, decentralized forms of governance and those who favor state-led, centralized forms of governance. There is therefore a pressing need for practicable policies which can help balance competing demands effectively. The Hague Institute's global apologies, it's the allergy season. The Hague Institute's global governance reform initiative fosters the development of such policies by bringing together a group of cyber governance experts from different sectors and regions to deliberate upon critical governance challenges in this domain and craft actionable policy recommendations. This conference has been convened with the participation and support of the Observer Research Foundation, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Clickendale as part of our Global Governance Reform Initiative. This project seeks to overcome the challenges of global governance in three important domains: cyberspace, oceans, and migration, by improving the efficiency, effectiveness, and legitimacy of collective action undertaken by relevant stakeholders. And as I said, this event brings together experts from different geographic regions, sectors, in an effort to craft governance solutions that are fair, inclusive, and importantly, effective. The authors were selected through a competitive application process in which they stood out for their informed, creative, and thoughtful approaches to resolving critical governance challenges. It gives me great pleasure to recognize our expert contributors. They're seated in the audience today, and they prepared excellent cutting-edge papers, and they represent a cross-section of geographic and sectoral backgrounds. And the aim is to identify new channels for cooperation in internet governance, building on a multi-stakeholder approach. I should also like to recognize and introduce our luminaries. Their work has been to review the papers of the expert luminaries, and we have 4 of our luminaries who are with us on the panel, and 2 of our senior expert contributors. I will just briefly now introduce the moderators, who will introduce in greater detail and more extensively the panelists. So the first moderator, Mr. Samir Saran, Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation. ORF is our knowledge partner on this initiative, and we've been delighted to work with ORF on this important project over the past year. Samir is former Vice President of Reliance Industries, India's largest business conglomerate. He holds a master's degree from the LSE and is also served as a fellow at Cambridge University. And Richard Ponzio is the head of the Hague Institute's Global Governance Program. Richard joined the Institute earlier this year following 5 years of service at the U.S. State Department in Washington in the Office of the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he's also had a previous career at the United Nations, including at the UN Development Program and the Peacebuilding Support Office. Richard holds degrees from Columbia, from Tufts, and from Oxford. So we will see how having somebody who has been a fellow at Cambridge and an Oxford graduate, how that affects the moderation this afternoon. So warm welcome to all of you, and you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Thanks for keeping us on our toes, too. Welcome, everybody. We're very delighted you could be with us this evening. As Dr. Williams noted, this is an integral part of a very rich conversation we've had these last few days this week here in The Hague on the future of cyber governance. And what you'll be hearing tonight is several of our leading experts that have been brought together. Unfortunately, as you see the size of our stage, we couldn't accommodate all of our experts. Many of them are sitting in the front rows here before you, and we're encouraging them to jump in with their ideas and questions, insights during the next hour. During the last part of our program, we will definitely have time to open it up to the entire audience and welcome your thoughts and questions and ideas. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to our key partner from our knowledge partner for this week's conference, Samir Saman of the Observer Research Foundation. And I've asked him to, before we make a quick round of introductions of our luminaries, to say a few words about his institute in New Delhi and a very important related meeting coming up this October.
Thank you, Richard. And first, I think we must, on behalf of the panelists, the experts, Observer Research Foundation, let me congratulate you for 2 excellent days of discussions and the hospitality. Outstanding. Let me make a little bit of a pitch for the large cyber conference we are hosting in New Delhi in October with the Hague Institute as our partners. We also have the government, or rather the Kingdom of Netherlands as our partner, as I was told they like to be referred to on logos. And we will be joined by Microsoft and some other private sector companies who are actively helping us shape our agenda and the discussion over the 3 days of program that we are designing. There are brochures for the last year's conference on that table there, and Mahima, this is for you. So the brochures are there, you can pick it up on the way out. Interesting debates. This is our small contribution to a multi-stakeholder platform in New Delhi. Let me confirm to you that India is not against the idea of multi-stakeholderism. India believes in multi-stakeholder. It is ingrained in us. I think we are a loud, voluble society, and all decisions eventually emanate from a kaleidoscope of views and opinions that shape our general outlook to everything we decide to do. Having said that, let me quickly introduce the first 3 of our panelists here. So first, let me introduce Mr. Sunil Ibrahim, who's second on my left. He is the director of probably the most influential institute in India on internet and society. He is the director of that institute, and he is focusing on issues around accessibility, the digital knowledge domain, internet governance, telecom, and other spheres of humanities. To my extreme left is Professor Laura DeNardis, who is the Internet Governance Scholar and Associate Dean of the School of Communication at American University. Among her book publications include the recently published book, The Global War for Internet Governance, through the Yale University Press, and also The Global Politics of Interoperability through the MIT Press. Finally, to my extreme right is Professor Milton Muller, who teaches at Syracuse University's School of Information Studies. His 2002 book, Ruling the Root, Internet Governance and Taming of Cyberspace, is considered the most definitive account of the political and economic forces behind the creation of ICANN. Over to you, Richard.
And the fourth panelist to the left of Samir, Mr. Paul Rosenzweig. He's the principal and founder of Red Branch Consulting, a homeland security consulting company. Mr. Rosenzweig is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security, the U.S. government, and is currently teaching at the law school at George Washington University. Fifth, I'm pleased to also introduce For our panel discussion tonight, to my right, Professor Nii Quaynor, who is among his many professional affiliations serving as the chairman of Ghana.com Limited, chairman of the ICANN Strategy Panel on Public Responsibility, and professor of computer sciences at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. Last year, he was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame for his pioneering work on the promotion of the Internet across Africa. And finally, I'm pleased to share to the right of Professor Quaynor, Ms. Rebecca McKinnon, who is the director of the Ranking Digital Rights Project at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. Ms. McKinnon has authored the book Consent of the Networked: The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom. And earlier in her career, she served as CNN's bureau chief in both China and Japan. So we are going to begin our conversation, and I'll start with an initial question to Professor DeNardis, who we're very, very privileged, in addition to what you heard about her background, is the research director for a very important new initiative, the Global Commission on Internet Governance. So we're hoping you could say a few words about what is also known as the BILT Commission, some of the themes and issues that you'll be exploring. But secondly, about your very recent and now famous book, I would argue, on the global war on internet for internet governance, to tell us a little bit about the key issue of civic engagement, why it's important, the barriers, and what needs to be done to overcome some of the barriers to greater civic engagement.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's very nice to be here. Thank you to the Hague Institute for Global Justice. I'll start by saying a few words about the Global Commission for Internet Governance, which was announced earlier this year at the World Economic Forum in Davos. It is being chaired by Carl Bildt, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Sweden. And it's already announced have been the distinguished commissioners involved in this initiative. Of one is on the stage, Nii Quaynor. So we have about 25 commissioners, and it's also supported by a global research advisory network. And we have a member of the Research Advisory Network to my right, and some in the audience as well from around the world. So it is very exciting. Some of the other commissioners include Henriette Esterhuizen from South Africa, and Dame Wendy Hall, Pindar Wong, Paul Twomey. So a lot of people who I respect very much. I'm excited about it. I'm excited to be the research director. It was formed by two independent think tanks. One is the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada, and then the other one was the Royal Institute for International Affairs, otherwise known as Chatham House in London. Now, it will be a 2-year initiative. It's just kicking off now. So 2 years from now, hopefully, we'll have some results. What is the mission? I'll just quickly say that. It's designed to serve as a rallying point for states that are interested in preserving a free and open internet. And hopefully we'll be able to come up with a strategic vision for internet governance that advances innovation, preserves human rights, and enhances governance legitimacy, as well as avoiding systemic risks. Now, on the topic of systemic risks, the book, I did select a provocative title, The Global War for Internet Governance. And I selected this title because, in my opinion and research, I really do believe that conflicts over internet governance are the new spaces where economic and political power is unfolding. These control points mediate civil liberties, they affect global innovation policy. They certainly are entangled in national security in many ways. Yet the technically concealed nature of these control points and the institutions that are involved, it's not intentionally concealed, but it's institutionally complex, technically complex, has kept these issues out of public view to a certain extent. So the message in the book really is that there are internet control points. The internet is governed. But my first chapter is called Internet Governance Oxymoron, because it's not necessarily enacted by governments, but by decentralized distributed governance structures that involve private industry, new institutions like ICANN, for example, and certainly a very strong role of the private sector. So what I've tried to do in the book is to lay out the various layers of how the internet is governed, and then highlight some of the open global debates that will determine the future of civil liberties and innovation.
Thank you. Professor Muller, you have recently co-authored a proposal to transform the ICANN into a truly global multi-stakeholder institution. For the benefit of the audience, can you share first what is the current relationship that the ICANN and the US government seem to have, and how would you see the implications of the change you propose on how the internet is to be governed?
All right, I'll do that. Thank you very much for inviting me here, and it's actually quite great to see the initiatives that the Netherlands is taking in this area on a variety of fronts. So I think the Netherlands can really be a force for good in this overall picture, this war, if you will. Laura referenced new institutions, new internet governance institutions. I call them the organically developed internet institutions. And they evolved independently of governments as the internet was being built up slowly. So one of these was a centralized point for coordinating unique domain names and the allocation of the addresses, the internet protocol addresses or IP addresses that actually guide packets to their destination as the data moves over the internet. So this is one of the few sort of centralized points. Fundamentally, it's about coordinating rather than governing the internet, but we've learned that there are certain ways in which policies can be linked to this coordination process. As an example, think of radio frequency spectrum. When you decide to give somebody a band of spectrum, you're not just saying, we're coordinating the technical management of the spectrum. We're also saying, you get the broadcast and maybe you don't. Right? So you have a similar kind of control. And when the US government initiated the process to create ICANN, which is what does this coordination now, they retained some kind of contractual control, a kind of political and contractual control over ICANN. And many of us said, look, if you want to be consistent about the multi-stakeholder model, if you really want to put this into the private sector and allow the internet community to govern itself, you have to sever that link. You have to let it go. And that didn't happen for the last 13, 14 years. And we've been having a debate about that. And other governments have been getting impatient and saying, well, if the US government is in there, why can't we be in control also? Why can't we share the control? So just last month, or actually in March, the US government announced it actually was going to finally end its control of ICANN through this contract. And now the interesting question is, well, if the US government isn't watching over ICANN and isn't able to pull away the contract if ICANN misbehaves or if something goes wrong, then how do we make ICANN accountable? And so we thought very long and hard about how to do this, and we presented a plan, which I will spend the next 45 minutes telling you about. No, seriously, there's a paper about it, but basically we said that you want to have a structural separation between the policy development process of ICANN and the actual technical management and implementation of the coordinating processes. And that's one way in which you divide the power and perhaps make this ICANN a little bit more accountable. And there's also a separate accountability process that ICANN itself has kicked off that's going to be going on for the next several months. So it's a very interesting time in internet governance. And just to wrap up, I would say if this whole model of non-governmental governance works, the ICANN-IANA transition is kind of the canary in the coal mine. If we can't do this right, we probably can't do the whole thing.
I'm just going to ask you a question. What are the odds of success? I mean, give me, you study it, how likely it is that by September 2015, when the U.S. says it's going to give it up, it's going to actually happen in a way that you think will be good?
I would say, as a bookie, that
Yeah.
the odds of that happening by September 15th, 2015 are about 45%. And the odds of it happening 1 year later would be maybe up to 60%. And then 2 years later, I would say you've got up to about 80%. I think the only question as to whether it can happen is how long it takes us to come to consensus on how to do it.
So it's not if, it's when.
I think so, yeah.
This has been a central theme of our discussions the last few days, the notion of non-governmental governance and a globalized ICANN. It's a very current debate, and you'll be hearing a lot about it over the next 12 months, leading into the 4th International Conference on Internet Governance hosted here in The Hague next spring. Another common theme of our conference, very related to this point raised by Professor Mueller, is the notion of multi-stakeholder approaches to Internet governance. Samir referred to it in his opening remarks. And we'd like to ask Sunil, what does that exactly mean in the Indian context, since we understand it's very much at the heart of how you approach a range of governance challenges, but especially this theme this week on Internet governance. And secondly, these themes came up not so long ago, a few weeks ago in Sao Paulo at a very important meeting, the Net Mondial meeting. And we understand that India, along with just 2 other countries, Russia and Cuba, decided not to endorse the final statement about promoting more inclusive forms of Internet governance, the multi-stakeholder model. But give us your take on what happened, please.
So before Snowden, it was easy to understand global Internet governance. If we are to borrow Hillary Clinton's terminology, we had good states, and we had bad states, and then we had swing states. The US, UK, and some European countries were the defenders of freedom. China, Russia, Saudi Arabia were examples of authoritarian states that were balkanizing the internet. And India, Brazil, and Indonesia were the so-called swing states. They could go either way, join the good side or join the dark side. And in terms of how they preferred certain models, the good states clearly were champions of the multi-stakeholder model, and the evil states or bad states preferred the multilateral model. But then Snowden happens, and US loses the higher moral ground and is no longer trusted by the global community as the primary steward or benevolent dictator of the internet. And Snowden continues to make revelations. He doesn't stop with the initial round. And he starts talking to world leaders. He tells the German chancellor that her phone is under surveillance. And the Brazilian president learns that her phone is also under surveillance, not for security reasons, for economic reasons. We should, of course, contrast this with how the Indian Prime Minister reacted when the Indian Prime Minister's office learned that his phone could be under surveillance. The statement to the press was that the Indian Prime Minister does not use a phone. So therefore we are not concerned. But the Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff, decides to do something proactive. She calls for acceleration of internet governance reforms, and in particular for this meeting, Net Mundial. So since the multi-stakeholder model hasn't really delivered outside ICANN, which Milton has covered, its technical fraternity and standard-setting bodies, Net Mundial became a big test for the multi-stakeholder model. Can the multi-stakeholder model go beyond being an opportunity for learning forums and discussion forums like the IGF? Can it actually produce soft law? That was the task before it. And depending on who you ask, it's either a huge disappointment or a great success. There are a variety of views. Now coming to your question of why the Indian government is perhaps skeptical of the multi-stakeholder model, to revisit what Samir said in his initial comments, it isn't a homogeneous view held across Indian government. Parts of the Indian government, such as the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology, believe in the multi-stakeholder model. The Ministry of External Affairs is a lot more skeptical, and I'm trying to understand the reasons for that. Number one, the multi-stakeholder model could be seen as a delaying or diversionary tactic by those who don't want to be regulated. Number two, the multi-stakeholder model could be seen only as a preparatory step before you actually move into hard, enforceable international law. And number three, I think the Indian government is increasingly concerned about how the multi-stakeholder model could be gamed. If you look very carefully at what they said, especially when they talked about civil society participation, they asked for greater accountability and transparency. It isn't as if the Indian government practices greater accountability and transparency, but they were concerned about certain actors from civil society and what they were saying, and whether they were speaking for themselves or whether they were just sock puppets for industry and the technical community.
So I think something we discussed in the morning was that many of these very key important debates are still first world problems. The format, rights, expressions, copyrights. I think the core issue that many of us in the South experience is how do we give access to the billions who don't have ability to connect to this medium. And so that brings me to Professor Nick Enor, who's been described as Africa's father of the internet for pioneering work in web development across the continent. The ITU data is disturbing. It says first that the developing world has only 31% of its population online compared to close to 80% in the developed world. And then it says that even in the developing world, Africa is only half of that in terms of internet penetration. So in your view, how important is the task of providing this basic access to the population in Africa? How will it roll out? What are the greatest challenges you see as you mobilize infrastructure and service providers? And finally, are we looking at a paradigm where individual nations are acting by themselves in Africa, or are we seeing an African Union policy emerge which can manage not only the issues of access, but as we increase the digital the depth of the digital engagements, even the larger and the first world issues that some of us have already discussed?
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here to share and also to learn. I must say that here in Netherlands, we do have some very good, colleagues from the technical community, and I'm glad to visit their country and see how successful they've been. To answer your question, it's probably not only important, but to an extent it's urgent. And the data you gave actually tells the story. But it's not always the worst case. There are some positive things, and our acquisition of access through mobile is phenomenal, and you may just be surprised. But it is still urgent, principally because of the economic growth implications of the use of the internet, implications in health, education, and so forth cannot be underestimated. And we are equally concerned about the deepening digital divide, not only between us and the outside of Africa, but also within our own nations as well. So, and even within social groups within the same community as well. So, in terms of the importance, it's clear that we have to do something special, even though we have some hope with the mobile opportunity. Now, the challenges, I'll describe them this way, taking advantage of the prior discussions regarding multi-stakeholder approach. I believe it is becoming impossible to have all the skills in one organization, be it a government or a company, to address some of the issues we are facing. So it becomes necessary that we leverage the multi-stakeholder and engage people outside of the organization to help address these issues. In other words, you cannot really rely on one government or one company to solve the problem. But if you take the truly let's go together approach and encourage the diversity and the debate in a multi-stakeholder environment, we can make progress. In essence, what I'm suggesting is that the policy environment needs to admit a multi-stakeholder approach, and then to deliberately apply it to motivate and demand that we move very quickly together by forgetting our own individual differences and the camps from which we come, to address a single issue of how do we give internet access to the community that needs it. Now, furthermore, I like to stress that we need to keep the internet open because we are still behind. If you start to close it now, you are actually making my case harder than it ought to be. So the same environment you guys have used to grow your economies, to have 80% we would like to share the same thing in also our growth. Lastly, on the African Union side, there are many things that African Union is uniquely placed to handle, especially in the harmonization of positions, policies, and some common good actions. And recently, we have seen a number of them in the area of establishing exchange points in Africa, because they argued, and correctly so, the importance of the performance advantages and cost savings advantages of keeping our traffic local, and they are doing something about it together with the Internet Society, which I think is worth noticing. Also, there are areas in the laws that needs to be harmonized, for example, for cross-border connectivity issues that I think not only African Union, but the different regional economic blocs may be uniquely placed to address, and we're looking forward to those sort of things being handled by them. We have also noticed a recent interest by the African Union in some of the work of domain names and trying to acquire or have access to .Africa for the purposes of, you might say, expressing African interests, and we consider that as all constructive things for our development.
Professor Quaynor, you mentioned the policy community needs to adopt multi-stakeholder approaches to advance this issue of access, increase connectivity, especially in the global south, in particular Africa. You served on the board of ICANN. Should that remain a focus of our attention on critical issues of access, or are you talking about other and maybe new, not even created multi-stakeholder forums that are required? We heard about NetMondial. There's the Internet Governance Forum. There's the meeting here in The Hague a year from now. What specifically do you have in mind? One or many different multiple forums?
Okay, I'm thinking about multi-stakeholder participation. Now, depending on the issue that you're trying to solve, I'm arguing that often you don't have the skills in-house to do it all. So you have no choice. You have to reach outside. And those kinds of participation are all loosely described as multi-stakeholder participation approaches. Now, we can take a look at the case of ICANN, and we can discuss those. We can take the case of how do I improve access in my country, which is largely national policies to increase investments and also improve our collaboration and cooperation with the environment. And that also requires, in my opinion, multi-stakeholder participation. Laws are made without consultation of the relevant people, and I think all those things make us actually not advance as fast as we can. So for me, the important thing is the participation needs to be multi-stakeholder. And depending on the issue you are addressing, then you can focus on what model makes sense for you.
Thank you very, very much. And we're always, of course, welcoming our other experts in the audience to jump in with your views and thoughts on these key issues from this past week. And we're now turning to our fifth expert from the conference, or on the stage this evening, Professor Rosenzweig. You were, as I noted, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the Department of Homeland Security. So you would know a lot about this critical issue of data surveillance and the need, the discussion we had this past week, the emphasis on guidelines being put in place for this critical issue of data surveillance in light of the revelations about the nature and scale of National Security Agency in the United States, the level of surveillance worldwide. But the question that many Europeans would have, and here in Holland, does it matter to have even national or regional guidelines? Is it more necessary to build consensus around a universal set of guidelines and norms to ensure somewhat of a common approach and a level playing field on this critical issue?
Well, thanks. I appreciate getting a really easy question that addresses something totally non-controversial. Makes my life interesting. I guess I'd make a couple of points about this. The first is that fundamentally, the problem of data valence is an unstoppable artifact of technological change. We are living in a world where increasingly there are more data sensors and collectors being deployed. Data storage costs are diminishing exponentially, and data analytic capabilities are increasing exponentially. And none of that's going to stop anytime in the near future. So the question of guidelines or regulations has to live within in my judgment, within the domain of the practical, of the possible, of what might actually be capable of reaching some agreement on. The second point I'd make is that that makes it very difficult because it's really hard to universalize across the globe conceptions of privacy, freedom of speech, and limitations on access to data. It's going to be, I suspect, to the extent that we do universalize it, it will only be at a very, very small, least common denominator sort of rule. What it strikes me is the more profitable or more likely way that we're going to reach a broader agreement is less on limitations on collection, because I don't think that can be stopped, but rather on limitations on use or consequences. The U.S. government, the White House, just put out a big data report the other day, and they started talking about this in the context of responsible use. And perhaps that's a concept that we can get around if you kind of project forward in terms of the private sector's responsible use. That's going to mean something like regulation and rules and law control. We saw an example of that just yesterday with the European Court of Justice's decision about Google's collection of data. But in the governmental context, that's going to be harder because, of course, there's no kind of binding international law and there's unlikely to be an agreement on that. So what it's going to actually have to turn on, I think, is, I mean, we've said it several times in different contexts, greater transparency, greater accountability, greater development of soft law norms of behavior that will be used to guide people and be argument points for you really shouldn't be doing that because we've established these norms. And I think it's not unreasonable to hope that over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, we'll consensus around some of those norms and that maybe it will be against the norm to listen in on Chancellor Merkel's cell phone as a public norm. That doesn't mean that countries won't do it, because I suspect that most countries will probably do it if they think it's very useful to them and they have a need. But it will give you a talking point that'll make it less the norm than the abnormal, and a reason to publicly speak adversely about countries that engage in that norm-violating behavior. And so it'll come at a cost and it'll reduce it somewhat.
And I know Sunil has a point here, and I know this is a very topical issue on many people's minds, so I welcome some of our other experts to please jump in with your views as well. Sunil.
I wanted to give a little bit of pushback when it came to the question of mass surveillance. And I think we need to understand the relationship between surveillance and security. My argument is that mass surveillance does not serve the security imperative. For this, we would use the evil Snowden hypothesis. Instead of Snowden leaking documents that serve the public interest, what Snowden could have done, if he was evil, was leak the data that has been collected through mass surveillance. Then imagine what would have happened in terms of criminals and terrorists using that type of data. So going back to the relationship between surveillance and security, if mathematically represented, on the x-axis we have the population, the percentage of the population under surveillance. On the y-axis we have security in the state. And the relationship is best described as an inverted hockey stick. When you place a small percentage of the population under surveillance, you get security returns. And as you put the whole population under surveillance, you actually undermine the security imperative. The head of the hockey stick might vary. In Canada, they've had only one terrorist attack in the last 20 years. Only 2 people died, really incompetent terrorists. So you have a very small number of people under surveillance. In India, third most bombed country in the world, much bigger hockey stick. So Canada is like a regular part of your meal, but India is a bit of a pickle. So to express it in gastronomic terms, surveillance is like salt in cooking, essential in small quantities, but counterproductive if in excess.
So let me go back to Paul. Paul, I think one of the responses to the Snowden episode was also some simplistic, impulsive reactions, envisaging bring the servers back home, data localization. The data bank should be in your own country. One argument was around the security of the sanctity of the data. And I think there are technical solutions available where we can ring fence data banks for certain users. But the other impulse, which is actually deeply embedded, is the jurisdiction issue. Is the issue of the fact that if there is a Indian conversation, economic transaction taking place on a server in Napa Valley, California laws apply. So how does the more fundamental nature of international law accommodate this digital distributed sovereignty, if I may use that term, distributed sovereignty, where nations have interest in different locations?
Oh, good. Another easy question, huh? Look, in an increasingly globalized world, choice of law and jurisdictional disputes are becoming much more common. They are always a cost of doing business, and the more that they are a cost, the more they diminish innovation, the more they diminish economic growth. There are only two ways to resolve that dispute. One is essentially by force, which is the way we sort of do it now. It's on the servers in Napa, damn it, US law applies, right? Or the converse impulse is we're going to build a new Brazil to EU fiber optic because that'll cut the United States out. That is always the wrong, I begin with the assumption that that's always the wrong answer. So the right answer has to be essentially taking existing rules of conflict of law, application, choice of law rules, and generalizing them. It's probably going to require the development of a set of default rules for which law applies and when, which will be a kind of predominant contacts rule generally. If two Indians are conducting a business transaction, happens to go through a server in Napa, the dominant contacts rule would say Indian law should apply as a background rule, and then people will negotiate amendments to that in commercial transactions along the way, I think. That's the ultimate rule. So the international project for The Hague is to write the draft choice of law, conflict of law resolution rules for the internet that are the background uniform commercial code of internet transactions, and then freedom to contract around it when people want to change that and choose California law because they like California better.
Professor Muller, you had a two-finger intervention.
Kind of building on that point, I think that one of the reasons we have been pushing for the so-called multi-stakeholder model, which really is more of a private sector or denationalized model, is precisely this reason of trying to demilitarize and de-jurisdictionalize as much of the internet as we can, so that we actually do have an integrated global space, and we don't have states competing with each other to run an arms race in cyberspace or to collect more data than the other guys so that they have more intelligence, and basically in some ways the states are competing to undermine the security of the internet rather than protect it, because they are buying vulnerabilities and stockpiling them and using them when they can to undermine the security of the internet.
So let me just pick on the private sector point here. Rebecca, you are director of the Ranking Digital Rights Project, which is basically creating an index which ranks world's major ICT companies on policies and practices related to freedom of expression, privacy, in context of the human rights laws. So again, an easy question to you. Are ICT companies doing enough to protect freedom of expression and privacy in the online space? If not, what should they be doing? And the easiest one, which of the ICT companies are at the forefront in their efforts to protect privacy and freedom of expression?
Well, thank you. So
a sneak peek into your index.
Quickly in 3 minutes. I'm not going to sort of predict who's going to rank most highly when we're still in methodology development phase, because that would cause accusations that I'm biased in advance. But I can certainly talk about categories of companies and cite examples of issues that specific companies have encountered along the way, with the caveat that I'm not prejudging who's going to rank where. Yeah, so are ICT companies doing enough? The short answer is no. The long answer is that it's complicated, of course, because the companies are interacting with states, and the states are not doing enough to protect rights. And in pretty much everywhere in the world where there is an internet, you have states making requests and demands of companies that arguably, according to human rights norms and law, violates free expression and privacy to varying degrees, including, as Snowden has reminded us, in the United States, sort of tearing apart Hillary Clinton's sort of dichotomy of good and bad states. It's much more complicated. So companies are facing demands around the world from states to hand over information, to take down content. Now, obviously, there are some legitimate law enforcement reasons to hand over data, but issues with, is the state being sufficiently necessary and proportionate in terms of takedown, content takedowns? Is there enough judicial review? Are sort of arbitrary demands being made? How are companies responding to demands? It's interesting. I started having conversations with companies about 10 years ago about their human rights obligations. And the attitude 10 years ago of a lot of internet companies was, what are you saying? We are human rights just by existing. How can you possibly criticize us? We're connecting everybody. We're empowering everybody. Go away. Stop complaining. The sector has matured. We have something called the Global Network Initiative that I've been involved with, where not a large number of companies now. It's kind of Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebook recently joined, LinkedIn very recently joined. And really nobody else have kind of signed on to some core principles about internet users' rights to free expression and privacy, and some core guidelines on how to respond to government demands. They're not, the GNI is not really dealing with consumer privacy issues, with other issues around data collection, with terms of service enforcement that doesn't relate to government demands, around which there are obviously lots of problems that end up affecting users' human rights as well. But some companies are starting to make some commitments. You have something called the Telecommunications Industry Dialogue, which is primarily a group of European telcos plus AT&T who kind of realize they need to start making some commitments and sign on to some principles around the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that kind of requires some due diligence. But companies are still very much in an early phase of figuring out how to actually meet these commitments. And with the GNI, there are requirements about you need to conduct a human rights impact assessment in determining how you're going to respond to government demands. You need to be more transparent about what you're handing over to governments, what you're taking down, what percentage of requests you're complying with. So we're starting to see a bit more transparency amongst a small handful of companies. But a lot of companies around the world, if you kind of do a broader global survey of how many telcos out there have made public commitments to human rights, how many telcos out there are doing human rights impact assessments that include free expression and privacy, not too many. And so we have a very long way to go. We have a long way to go in terms of consumer privacy practices, just meeting some basic standards. We have a long way to go in terms of companies thinking about, am I enforcing, am I creating terms of service that are actually free expression compatible, that actually provide some protection, that have some recourse if the company is sort of applying them arbitrarily. So we have a long way to go. I think that the public generally doesn't have a lot of clarity about the differences between different companies in terms of how their commitments differ, how their practices differ. So one of the reasons why we're doing this project is to try and bring more public clarity about the differences among companies, who's doing what, who's not doing what, at least what their basic practices are, so that people can make more comparisons. And also, just a final point, it's also very clear from our methodological research and, clear anyway, that there are some companies that are handicapped much more severely than others because of the legal regimes in which they are headquartered. And so I'm also hoping that we will be able to shine some light on which governments are handicapping their companies in which way from being globally competitive as far as user trust is concerned. Because this is becoming a bigger issue amongst consumers, amongst investors, and a company that, is required by its government to do a lot of things within its home jurisdiction, will they be able to obtain trust as they go global? Or if they're just nobody in their home jurisdiction is bothering about them about these issues, and they start to go global, and they're not adhering to some global standards around free expression and privacy, can we start identifying and sort of placing more pressure, from the market on companies to adhere to global human rights standards?
That's a great segue to my follow-on question, because you mentioned a few examples. They're all truly global, multinational enterprises, but headquartered in the United States. We were very fortunate this past week to have participants from China, Brazil, Mexico, Russia. And so I welcome your inputs to this question. But first, Rebecca, given your extensive knowledge but work on the ground in China and Japan, she taught in Hong Kong for several years. How are they approaching these issues of privacy, protecting the rights of the users, as Alibaba going global?
Yeah.
These new enterprises are not going to be based in one country anymore.
Yeah, but they tend to be headquartered in one country and are sort of coming out of a particular point of view. I mean, there have been some arguments made. For instance, why is it that the world's major social media companies come out of the United States? That may have something to do with the First Amendment and safe harbor and kind of the structure. Although one can debate that. But the challenge, Chinese companies do face a challenge in that. So, for instance, if we were to tell Baidu or Alibaba or Sina, you need to do transparency reporting, the way Google does, they could probably do it for jurisdictions outside of China. But if they were to produce a transparency report about the government requests they're receiving in China, they will be violating state secret laws. And so this is a problem, but it also shows how the domestic legal regime is handicapping a company's ability to adhere to expectations of users around transparency and to compete with companies that aren't constrained by, you're a global company, but your headquarters is in a jurisdiction. As Milton likes to remind us, states still do have quite a lot of power. They can put people in jail. They can shut down your company. They can confiscate your bank account. Many things can happen, and that's real. And so, this is part of the challenge, of course, with looking at what companies, to what extent can you mitigate risks, but ultimately, some states are handicapping, some of their companies. In other contexts, for instance, we did some research. Actually, a colleague of Sunil's was involved, where we talked to some Indian companies, and it wasn't a matter so much of the Indian government saying no, you can't do transparency reporting, or no, you can't have better privacy policies, but it was just more about the companies hadn't focused on it so much. It wasn't such a priority. And so I think there are cases where actually kind of shining a bit more light and kind of talking about the issue in more of a set of international norms, I think can help raise the bar globally. And we've certainly seen that with environmental practices and labor practices and so on, where you say, look, here's some core global standards, and companies need to meet this in a more global manner. But it's difficult, certainly.
We saw somebody in one of the front rows had a hand up.
So maybe I can just come in.
Directly.
Quick.
So, as part of our research that we did with Rebecca, we were looking at the annual report of Indian telco. And instead of being ashamed of the fact that they were infringing on the rights of their users, they were proud of it. They were saying, on so many occasions, we got an opportunity to serve national security, and we responded immediately. So you have to take those Indian telcos from that place to a place where they think that human rights is a core value in their business.
So I think my question actually leads up from there, Sunil, and this is for Paul again. You mentioned there are two elements to the whole business of data. One is collection and one is usage. And most nations have some sort of legislation that obviously warrants a certain procedure followed for collection, as well as what you can do with it after you've collected it. The issue is not of the citizen protection here. It is the protection of the non-citizen. The NSA surveillance could not have harmed the US citizen like it could any other non-citizen. And how do you think, what could the global community be discussing in this particular aspect?
Boy, you keep asking me the easy ones, huh? I think that the idea of a globally applicable rule that will protect citizens and non-citizens alike for all jurisdictions is unlikely. We had a paper earlier this week that we called what did we call Oleg? Optimistic or idealistic. That was it. I mean, it would be a nice regime system, but I think that the idea that any sovereign nation is likely to stop drawing distinctions between its own citizens and non-citizens, it's too fundamental. I mean, it's what defines a sovereign, really, is control over your citizens or their adherence. So I think that would be very, very hard to do on a global scale. We might see an agreement
Bilaterally.
Bilaterally, or amongst like-minded nations with similar views, like US-EU, US-EU-India, but it'd be awful hard to do it globally.
Yeah, just to push back a bit against that. So we, at the same time as we're saying that we don't want data localization laws. We don't want governments to set rules that confine data to particular jurisdictions and try to border the flow of that data. And I think that the argument against data localization is essentially saying that, information is being globalized and surveillance capabilities are being globalized. That was sort of the amazingly shocking thing about the NSA, was the extent of the globalization of the surveillance. And the distinction between citizens and non-citizens then becomes one that the US in particular, because of its global reach, has to perhaps erode. And the Obama administration actually made some overtures in that direction, saying maybe we should actually globalize or at least extend some serious privacy protections to non-citizens as well as citizens. And I would support that as the kind of initiative that we should encourage, or that certainly this internationally minded, international law-minded group here in the Netherlands should be building upon, because it really is it may be the case, this may be an extreme statement, but it may be the case that if you don't have globalized protection from surveillance, you don't have any protection.
I think that's probably actually accurate, which is to say that the lack of a global norm is going to devolve to the least common denominator. And though right now people are quite content to kind of kick American shins, and the NSA has made it easy to do so, you can imagine any number of regimes around the globe that would be even less likely to be respectful of human rights, and that's going to prove a huge barrier, I think, to the development of a globalized norm. The other piece I would put in is this in particular is an area where the enforceability problem is huge, which is you don't know that your data has been raped you can't. It happens behind closed doors in a lot of ways.
So we're about to open it up to all of you for your questions or additional points you might wish to add, but we have one last question building on this discussion, both about data valence and the protection of privacy. So the question for Professor DeNardis, you mentioned at the beginning of our conference on Tuesday morning the importance of not looking at this notion, this core concept of our meeting these past 2 days, multi-stakeholder approaches to governance, as a one-size-fits-all solution. We heard many different issues that were addressed today, and the importance, multi-layer approach, as you referred to earlier, of addressing each layer with perhaps a different multi-stakeholder approach. But on these two key issues of data valence, working towards a common norm and understanding and maybe set of guidelines, and then the privacy issues and protection of the user's rights that Rebecca referred to, is there an ideal form out there that can be sort of reformed or updated, or do we need to innovate, especially with this opportunity of a new ICANN being discussed in certain circles?
This is a very important point that you're making, and indicative of this is a question that I often get, and it's the following: who should control the internet? Should it be ICANN? Should it be the United States government? Should it be Google? Or should it be the United Nations? And on its face, that question makes absolutely no sense, because we have layer upon layer upon layer of internet governance systems. I want to defend the internet governance system for a moment. You don't know who your IT manager is until your network goes down. Then you know them very well. Part of the reason that people don't know the various layers in the institutions is because, on a general level, the internet has remained operational, including in the area of cybersecurity. So you have standard-setting institutions like the Internet Engineering Task Force and the World Wide Web Consortium that set standards. You have various cybersecurity layers. You have various private institutions who have very technical roles that are also policy roles. And then you have this whole area that is often discussed, ICANN. So it's important to disaggregate internet governance into these different layers. And I also want to say something provocative in answer to your question and say that multi-stakeholderism cannot be the answer to every single question that we have. There are certain areas where the worst case scenario is going to a multilateral solution and bringing governments into an area where it's private sector led. In other areas, you want the government to lead. So it's very important to say, what is the area of internet governance? How do you provide the appropriate accountability and transparency to have input and reflect the public interest? But I do want to disaggregate all of these different areas. And by the way, privacy, just as a single area, is enacted in about 11 different institutions. I mean, even that's not a single area. So it's very important to have discussions such as this one, and to start bringing in people with different perspectives so that you can hear what these various layers are.
So now we open up the floor to all of you and any of these topics and ones we might not have touched upon related to the future of governance, internet governance, and but love to hear your thoughts as well on issues such as access to the internet, increasing connectivity, privacy issues, but there's not just one privacy issue, as we just heard, data valence, as it's called, a very important current issue. The floor is open. Please, Mahima.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a question for Professor Quainer. Sir, you were talking about the Global South, and you were saying that what we really want is for conditions to remain the same that helped some of the northern countries grow and get the kind of internet penetration that they have today. And I've been listening to the talks for the past 2 days, and it's just occurring to me, and it's a question. For example, we talked about data localization. And one of the themes that Samir mentioned as well was it's a jurisdiction issue. So my assumption would be that when American businesses were growing, it was their law that applied to them. And so it was perhaps easier for them to tackle any legal issues that came about. Now, with countries, African countries, Indian countries, if the jurisdiction lies in the US, that's an added layer of problems. So, certain conditions like this, what do you think? Do you think that the conditions will remain the same for the Global South in the future for their internet business, economy, governance to grow, or does it change? I hope I was sort of clear. Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate that there will be always jurisdictional problems, but the internet knows no boundaries, really. Okay, so I don't want to dwell on that. I want to dwell on it being open so I can push my people through. Once I've gotten beyond the 50%, we can talk. But as it is now, I mean, you're making me go on the discussion with my hands tied behind me, and it's not very nice. I mean, I do appreciate that I'll bump into these jurisdictional problems as I go, but I'll address them case by case, maybe do some bilateral things to help me, move along. But the most important thing is that it should remain open so we can learn, okay, we can participate. And I use this opportunity to tell you that had the pioneers not defined before the 90s CCTLDs for African countries, we could have been excluded. Had they not defined numbering systems globally, there would have been no AFRINIC, there would have been no AFTLD, there would have been nothing. But we were very fortunate that these folks were so, nice to us that they opened it up. And that made it possible for people like me to organize ourselves and then try to, in some sense, begin to fulfill those roles. Now, it's the same thing I'll say for tomorrow, that if you close it now, maybe there are things we could build that you've shut down. So bear with us, help us rather jump across. When we get close enough, we can have a more meaningful discussion. I mean, what's the point of having a discussion with people who don't even know what it means to have human rights? Because they're only just beginning to grapple with it within their own countries offline, and now you're saying, let's discuss it about online. It may not be the right thing to do. I mean, rather, let's encourage ourselves to advance quickly, get closer, and then we can have a much more meaningful discussion. Will be my take.
Non-direct barriers, yeah.
Please. Oh. Other questions from the audience?
Neil wanted to come in.
Neil? Sunil? We have a response to this last point, and then we'll take another question from the floor. Sunil.
Just to give another example, we seem to be arguing for equivalence. That is, rights that are protected offline should also be protected online. But from Africa and perhaps other parts of the world, we can think of leapfrogging even in terms of rights. So in Malaysia, when internet was first regulated through law, people were given more rights on the internet in terms of speech than they had offline. So the equivalence argument doesn't work there.
I saw a couple hands up. Please, Georgia.
I want to ask you all, is the internet so unique that we cannot extrapolate from existing arrangements in other fields? For example, I think, Richard, you mentioned the broadband, the spectrum, let's say, right, of broadcasting, etc. There is the ITU, there is ICAO for planes. It's not exactly the same, but I think we have some institutions that are multilateral, and there is also a private sector role in them. So why are we pretending, I think, to be a bit so unique, this one, and why don't we build on similar models that are more inclusive? And for me, it's equally suspicious to have, let's say, a private company or somebody who has stated good intentions and may have good intentions, but can be also abused, who is not accountable to a parliament or something else, or a judiciary. So I think, can we build on what exists for other areas?
And I welcome any member of the panel to jump in on any of these questions, please.
Well, the internet is different in one very fundamental respect, and that is that it was built up independently of these state institutions for about 20 years. And you had these, as I said, the organically developed internet institutions that were governing its fundamental architecture. And now you bring in states and the traditional institutions, and number one, they don't understand what's going on half of the time. So for example, when you bring the governments into ICANN and ask them how to make policy decisions, frequently you have some very strange demands being made. For example, governments have proposed that the word .health, because it's a TLD that invokes the concept of health, should be subject to systems of medical regulation in every jurisdiction in the world. So basically what you're saying is, forget about having a .health top-level domain. You're never possibly going to conform to all the regulatory overhead that would be associated with that. And that's just one of what could be a litany of dozens and dozens of examples of, they're not, many of them are well-intentioned interventions, but they simply don't understand the interaction between the technical system and the policy and economic effects. And for that to happen, you have to have multi-stakeholder institutions in which those people are brought into ongoing dialogues and interactions with the operational people, and they learn as they go along to the consequences of their decisions. And the other thing is it's transnational by default. It started transnational. It didn't it's not like a telephone system where you had, a territorial local telephone system that then interconnected with somebody regionally and then internationally step by step. It was global from the beginning. And so then the states want to superimpose some kind of jurisdictional overlay on it. Again, you're creating barriers. You're stopping things from evolving rather than building.
Professor Donatis.
Yeah, I'll heap on to what Professor Mueller said. I think that the internet also varies in a couple of other fundamental ways. One is the fact that it just completely transcends territorial boundaries in a way that no other technology, including spectrum, has ever done. So is the jurisdiction based on where the server is located, where a domain name is registered, where the company exists? There are global virtual resources that have to be unique. They completely span national borders. So it's very difficult to overlay a traditional governance model onto that. A second fundamental way in which it differs, and I think that I could argue against this point myself and take the other stand, but it's the nature of the rapid technological change. So the internet is constantly changing. There are some fundamental standards that have been in place the entire time, but rapid development, rapid change is a fundamental nature. And so having a slow-moving intergovernmental organization overseeing that with layer upon layer of bureaucracy, I think would be the worst case scenario for the pace of innovation in that kind of an environment.
And one more comment on this point, Ms. McKinnon.
Sure, yeah. I mean, all of that said, and I don't disagree with anything either of you just said, but I think we do need to acknowledge, too, that we're still in the very early days of figuring out how to make multi-stakeholder governance really work and make sure it's really accountable. And one of the complaints I heard coming out of the Net Mundial was that companies kind of had two votes, right? They had their own stakeholders, and then they lobbied the governments who kind of acted on their behalf, and that civil society was outgunned a bit. And then how do you make sure that when you have a multi-stakeholder process that it's not just the rich countries and the companies with the most resources kind of really steering the thing, and that everybody, that you really do have all interests considered, and kind of how the public interest is being considered. But it's a problem because, again, whether governments are really being accountable to international human rights norms or the global public interest is also a big question. But there is a problem. One of the other critiques about multi-stakeholderism is that sometimes some actors will kind of use it as a cover not to be accountable. And so we need to make sure that as we go forward, that that's not the case, that you don't just have companies saying, well, we're participating in a multi-stakeholder process, and so therefore we're covered, or governments doing the same. And how do you make sure there's real accountability in that system? I think we're in very early days kind of working that out.
Thank you. And I know we had questions on the left side. Is the microphone still on the right side of the room?
No, it's on the left now.
It's not? Okay, well, we'll go to Gideon then. And please, a gentleman in the back row.
Yeah, Ekman Dommering from the University of Amsterdam. I have a question for Milton. We started your stay in the Netherlands with an interesting conversation, so I would like to continue the conversation on a specific issue. I heard you say that you were against jurisdiction based on data localization. Is that correct? Is that all?
I'm against trying to localize data or data sovereignty.
Legally, but I haven't had the time to study the decision of the European Court of Justice in detail yet in the Google case. But I thought that the Google case argued that they had nothing to do with European law. And that was an argument that was not taken over by the court, which seems that the court held Google accountable under European law, which is a rather data localized approach. So what's your comment on that?
And before Professor Muller responds, I should note that data localization was one of the themes covered in the 16 papers presented at this week's conference. We will get them into wide circulation in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for a deeper analysis. But I'm going to request that responses are quite brief now because we have a few more questions and we'd like to get through them all. Professor Muller.
Right. So you're conflating application of jurisdiction with data localization, and they're two different things. So data localization means that in order to conform to our laws, you have to keep your data in a particular server in a particular jurisdiction. And so the Google actually is, in some ways, a global extension of European jurisdiction. They're saying to Google, whatever your search engine returns for you, if somebody in Europe asks you to pull it off, you've got to pull it down for somebody probably also in India and America because of the economies of scale of trying to adapt to that. So they're different things. We can talk more about it.
Gentlemen in the front row in traditional Dutch orange. We're very...
My name is Erik Huizer. I'm a professor at Utrecht University. First of all, I'd like to react to a remark made by the gentleman earlier over there who asked why we couldn't use traditional institutions like ITU who are much more inclusive than multi-stakeholder. And I take offense in that statement because I think the multi-stakeholder model is much more inclusive than any of the existing organizations out there. I would also argue against Milton's remark that I think multi-stakeholder models, while not far from perfect yet, are functioning quite well, and we're working on accountability and transparency. And if you add all the governments in this world up, I would bet that their transparency and accountability is much less than what we've achieved so far, even within ICANN. However, my question is to the point that one of the more difficult points I see we need to solve, and I really have no clue on how to go about it, so I like the view of the panel, is cyber criminality. Cyber criminality by definition is multinational, and you can't solve that by a simple multi-stakeholder model. You have to battle that, and you have to deal with all kinds of legal issues in all kinds of different countries which have their own autonomy over their own legal system. And what is forbidden in the Netherlands is not forbidden in Russia. And how are we going to deal with those kind of issues? How are we going to, for example, take action against massive denial of service attacks instituted from several different countries?
Paul, would you care to take another tough question?
Oh, gosh, you just keep pointing at me. First, I would agree with the premise of with the unstated premise of your question that we have done poorly at it so far. The convention, the Budapest Convention on Crime, is a nice start on harmonizing law, but even amongst people who agree on criminality, it has been less than fully successful in terms of easing cross-border cooperation in the development of actual cases. So the laws are now harmonized, but the practice is still difficult to do. It becomes particularly difficult when a number of countries do not sign that convention. And I think that the answer to the best answer I can give to you is that in the end, everybody, or almost everybody, joined Interpol because they wound up seeing a sovereign-based benefit to themselves of tracking down their own bad actors who had fled overseas. We will reach a point at which we can deal with cyber criminality when those countries that currently are not as forthcoming in assisting it see greater benefit in assisting a global law enforcement structure than they do in not. And that will only happen when they themselves become equivalent victims of criminality that comes from outside their own borders, so that they, a hypothetical country X, benefits from being able to interact with the Netherlands against Netherlands hackers who attack country X just as much as the converse. So I'm afraid my answer to you is that the conditions are not ripe, because that's not an accurate description of the economic reality right now. Countries benefit from essentially being havens for criminality, and I suspect that they will for quite some time to come. The only other answer is to use other mechanisms of soft power to cajole, impel these countries to join that. Though it's unlikely that the West will ever impose economic sanctions on somebody for not adopting the Cybercrime Convention. But that would be the other way to get there, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So maybe that's a message of despair, but it's a realistic message.
Now, fortunately, I saw two of our expert participants from this past week's conference raise their hands, and I'm going to ask both of them to go in succession. Please, besides introducing yourself, your organization and the country that you're coming from, so our audience can get an idea of the diversity of our group. So, where's the microphone? So I'll point it out. Maybe first to Mr. Gideon here in, okay, first we'll start with Alejandro, Professor Pisanti from the National College of Mexico.
Hello, I'm Alejandro Pisanti from the National University of Mexico, also the chair of the Internet Society chapter in Mexico. A brief skimming comment. I think that for an audience that is not as deeply immersed in the diversity of issues as experts are, there may be an encouraging message to emerge instead of a despairing message like this issue is so complex and people complain about all these new institutions. They are, there's one voice that tells you they are great, and then there's someone showing you all the troubles, all the holes in that sponge. I would say that a very productive path forward for an institution like this in the Netherlands could be to look at some very specific problems that of the internet that appear to be in need of a governance solution or improvement. Look at solutions that already exist, as Laura has said, among others, they work, like ICANN. And instead of continuing to pick ICANN with pins and pull, it's like a toy voodoo doll where everybody has tried to see how it looks when you strangle it, how it looks when you shave off the plush, how it looks when you pull at the eyes or tie the tongue. That's an exercise. But it has proven immensely resilient to criticism, not only to the challenges of reality, but also to all this kind of criticism. At this point, we have a laboratory experience there of more than 15 years of how certain things can be made to work in a multi-stakeholder mechanism with accountability, with transparency, with things that went wrong, but use them productively and constructively to see how you can use an institution like that to fill the gaps that exist in a gap analysis between the situation you have and something like cybercriminality, which is big, or something much more concentrated, in like other problems that have been discussed today. How much, for example, you can bring organizational experience into other issues. And as I said, I think that a place like The Hague, this institute, and the Netherlands, because of its crossroads experience, could be ideal places to put some issues under the magnifying lens, see if an ICANN-like thing is a model for the multi-stakeholder extension of present mechanisms or creation of new innovative mechanisms, and fill those gaps and learn something from it.
Thank you very much. And we'll also hear from our colleague, Gideon. We're going to take our next colleague's intervention.
Thank you. My name is Gideon Ropp from a company called .Connect Africa in Kenya, and I'm pleased to be here among all of you. My quick comment would be on the fact that the leapfrogging of the developing regions in the world as concerns the internet development. And I thought I'd say that as much as we think or someone has said that we should maintain the status quo until Africa can catch up. I think no one is willing to wait for that catch up, and maybe leapfrogging will be it's what Africa has to do, or the developing nations have to do. But again, the leapfrogging comes with the challenges of having to quickly, deal with it's like you have a solution and then you now start dealing with your problems. So trying to go around, quickly catching up and making the solution to be local, not data this time, but localizing the solution to fit in the framework. So again, we still have the bureaucracies within maybe the government, and sometimes the private sector has done a good job to, develop most of maybe the fiber and the internet connectivity and even issues with the governance. So it's a whole mix of, issues that need to, be addressed together as a package. Thank you.
Okay. So at this point, I'll welcome any final comments from our experts here on the stage in response to both Gideon's excellent intervention on access and connectivity, especially in Africa. So I'll turn to Professor Quaynor and then hear our colleagues any final points about what Alejandro shared with us on ICANN and the future of cyber governance. Professor Quaynor.
I think we do have severe capacity issues. There's no question about that. And it's not only in terms of the infrastructure, but even our legal system's readiness for what we are discussing is in question. But at the same time, I think we may have a worse situation if the opportunity to learn in some sense is curtailed. So I tend to favor that what has made it possible for us to come this far since the 91 when the internet got to Africa has been the fact that it was open. And standards processes were open processes. You might say promotional issues regarding advocacy issues were open. Organizations like ICANN were very open, which means I could just come and sit there and learn. Now, if you start to localize and you start to put boundaries there, in my opinion, localization immediately breaks your privacy. For you to know that I'm local, you have to look at my things. Once you start doing that, I can't guarantee you what happens thereafter. So from my point of view, there are enough other things we can do to, in some sense, keep things sane. However, fundamentally changing the internet and its administration or coordination can be a problem. Now, beyond that, I will tend to say that I'm not looking for just, ICANN issues. I'm saying that within my country, if my ministry were to reach out more in policy processes to other stakeholders, those impacted, those not impacted, they will make richer policies and longer lasting policies. Whether it has to do with cybercrime or has to do with education, or for that matter, strictly the internet, is not material. The participative process, to me, is most important. And I don't think that our governments in our region have yet done that. I'm not even sure that many of our own, players, parties, do that. And I'm beginning to argue that that is what is causing some of the problems. We need to be a little bit more open. We need to be willing to hear the opposite of what we wish, so that we can reposition our thoughts to become more the norm than to be dealing with the extremes. That is really the posture that I'm trying to take. And I don't care what the specific issue is, but I'm saying that participation needs to be a little bit more tolerant, a little bit more inclusive, and to an extent open, so that the whole world can see that we are addressing this issue and we might get help, or in some sense we might ourselves be pushed to take you might say a common position which is acceptable. That would be my general reaction.
Thank you very, very much. Any final comments from our terrific panel this evening?
You're looking at me, so I will comment. Well, on Gideon's point, which is very important, think about how the next billion internet users will probably primarily come from the developing world. The growth is much faster in the developing world. And that is going to have to be reflected into the various governance structures. Whatever is multi-stakeholderism or various forms of governance at the various layers will have to be reflective of that to be inclusive. On the excellent point that Alejandro made, which made me laugh very hard about the voodoo doll, there's a very fundamental point that's embedded in that. And that's that various debates and discussions about internet governance are often a proxy for some totally different issue. And here's an example of that, and then I'll just quickly say it, and whoever else wants to comment, that would be great. The world explodes over the NSA surveillance revelations. And so what do we discuss? The root zone file. So for people who don't know what that is, I'm not going to describe it here, but it's we throw these pieces of meat around to be chased, and some of it obfuscates, some of it distracts, but it's very important to look at the geopolitics of all of this, and to say that often, like whack-a-mole, these issues come up around different institutions and in different fora, and it can be a proxy for broader geopolitical struggles.
Just, I think the broader issue regarding multi-stakeholderism is that we don't want to assume that this is a well-defined model, that it is perfect, and that it doesn't need any work. I think with ICANN and the transition that it's going into, we're learning. It's like I said, it's decoupling ICANN from governments for the first time, and this is as I said, a canary in the coal mine. If we can't make it work there, we still haven't solved the accountability problem with multi-stakeholder institutions. Participation is important, and that's why people are buying into these new institutions, is because everybody can get into them and they can participate. But having a voice is useless if a board of decision makers can simply ignore that voice, if that board is not accountable to any constituency, if they can simply sit there in power and make decisions without regard to what they're hearing from the participants. So with most multi-stakeholder institutions, we are still work in progress regarding their fundamental accountability and their extensibility to billions of people in developing countries.
Before I turn over to Samir for a final comment and to wrap up our program, I'd like to share one of our participants in yesterday's discussion. It was actually held in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in The Hague, reminded us that after 13 short years after the launch of the Sputnik satellite, and of course he was from Russia, noted that the first international space treaty was, I guess, acceded to and then ratified shortly afterwards. And that maybe it's not an international treaty on cyber governance, but the point was well taken. Complex issues can be responded to effectively by the international community. Consensus can be built. We can build new institutions, as we've seen recently here in The Hague with the International Criminal Court, which was an idea around for many years, and it finally came into existence. So these are tough issues, but the period is really ripe to be having this kind of discussion, and we're very pleased at the Hague Institute to be helping to make a contribution. We had a terrific week, and we thank all of you for being with us this evening. Samir.
Thanks, Richard. So before, I just have one small, in fact, 2 or 3 small thoughts to share. The first is, as we debate governance and internet, the future of the internet, the first reality is in the last 10 years, we have seen the return of the state. The state is more assertive than it was a decade ago. We have seen the big powers back in business. And how they communicate with each other is eventually going to create the framework within which, whether multi-stakeholder or multilateral conversations will need to take place. The boundaries, unfortunately, are still going to be decided by the geopolitics of the internet. But we have the power because of the dispersion of this medium to challenge that old paradigm. And I think that's something that all of us must continue. We must try chipping on the wall and getting a way in. But still, that's one thought. The state is back. The second is that this conversation is uniquely positioned because it sees three well-funded, well-oiled, well-greased groups, engaged in a conversation. The security community, which has lots of budgets at stake. They want to securitize this conversation as quickly as possible, make it into a issue where annual budgets are drawn for. You have the rights groups from DC and Western capitals who can see a huge pile of money if this conversation is about rights alone. You have the companies, and we don't talk about it enough, the economic interests. And I don't believe any corporation is going to allow a multi-stakeholder model to decide his business models. Again, we'll have to keep chipping there. So the rights groups have their task cut out here. They have, on the one hand, economic interests. On the other hand, they have the geopolitics of the internet. And luckily, for the first time, they have sufficient voice to actually take on both of them in debates around trade. The level of intensity was far smaller, far lower. And I think that's the interesting thing about internet, that it's more like an equal battle now between the citizen and the hierarchical, patriarchal power structure. But I still believe the state is back. On that happy note, the one thing we can all be certain of is that internet works. It's doing well. You'll be still connected when you go back home. It'll be working. Talk to each other, chat to each other. Thank you for coming here, and thank you to our luminaries, as they are called, and the expert panel for joining us over these last 2 days. It was a pleasure working with Sash, Jill, and Richard. Willem, thank you for joining us this evening. Finally, we look forward to seeing all of you in Delhi. Otherwise, you can catch our webcast on October 16th and 17th from the conference, where we will partner with this team again and with the government in Den Haag. So thank you, and please join us outside.
Please join us for a reception now to meet all of the participants from this week's conference. Thank you once again. Thank you.